The rain had only just stopped. The cobblestone still wept under the velvet of the blue cloth rolled across Westminster. She moved slowly, deliberately, not with the gait of a girl, but with the rehearsed solemnity of someone who had imagined this moment 1,000 times and survived 1,000 others she wasn't meant to. On January 15th, 1559, Elizabeth Tudor placed her foot upon England's sacred stage, not as a daughter, not as a wife, but as a sovereign. 3 crowns would be laid upon her head that day, each heavier than the last, not with gold, but with memory. This was no ordinary coronation. It was theatre. Yes, but beneath the ceremony lay dread and defiance, layered as finely as the embroidery on her robes. The people cheered. Bells rang. The air smelled of damp incense and rosewater. But Elizabeth had seen how quickly joy could rot into mourning. She had watched her mother disappear behind prison gates. She had heard whispers that she herself was illegitimate, perhaps even cursed. She had learned the language of survival, fluent not in diplomacy alone, but in silence, in restraint, in the art of not flinching when a blade was drawn too close. She did not arrive at the Abbey merely as Henry's daughter. She arrived as a woman who had already walked beside ghosts. As she passed through the nave, one might imagine her fingers brushing the stone walls not out of reverence, but out of calculation. Each step was deliberate, each breath controlled. She knew the stage she now ruled had already claimed so many as victims. The Latin chants washed over her, but her thoughts were her own. Her father had once stared into the faces of cardinals and broken with Rome. Her sister had drenched the kingdom in smoke and shrieking flames. And she, Elizabeth, stood now at the center of that same altar, neither martyr nor heretic, but something altogether new, a woman who had outlived her own burial rites. The anointing was slow. The oil touched her skin in 7 sacred places, the shoulders, the chest, the hands, and finally the crown of her head. The old bishop's hands trembled, not just from age. He, too, knew the weight of prophecy. This queen was not born from consent, but from conflict. And so, as the coronation ring was slipped onto her finger, a ring meant to marry her, not to man, but to England itself, Elizabeth closed her eyes, not to pray, but perhaps for a flicker of a moment, to remember. The dark tower, the echo of boots, the breathless mornings waiting for the door to open and for it to be the end. The crowd saw a monarch, but she felt the cold beneath the cloth. When she rose from the throne, she smiled carefully, and behind her eyes, something ancient turned not triumph, but vigilance. She had been born in thunder and baptized in denial. When Elizabeth came into the world on a September day in 1533, the astrologers had promised a boy, sworn by their stars, that England would receive an heir. Instead, the court unwrapped a daughter. The christening robes had already been stitched for a prince, the warm water already drawn in expectation of triumph. Still, the rituals went on. The font steamed, the trumpets flared, but behind the music hung an unspoken disappointment, one that would ripple through her entire life like a stain on silk. The imperial ambassador refused to attend the ceremony, mocking Anne Boleyn, her mother, as little more than the king's whore and Elizabeth as her bastard issue. Her existence was both a public spectacle and a private scandal. Her title of princess evaporated within 3 years, when her mother fell not to illness or exile, but to the axe. Condemned for adultery, incest, and treason charges whispered by men who had once bowed to her beauty, the child was too young to remember the day Anne Boleyn was executed on Tower Green. Yet somehow the silence that followed that event became part of Elizabeth's earliest memory. Where other children learned to cry from hunger, Elizabeth learned not to speak too much, not to trust too easily, and never to believe that love could not be revoked by decree. Henry VIII declared her illegitimate in both law and in blood. a political recalibration so precise that it transformed his daughter into a stranger. She went from Her Highness to the Lady Elizabeth, and the court around her shifted as if she were plague-touched. Her belongings no longer fit. Lady Brian, her caretaker, wrote pleading letters asking for clothing and instruction should the child dine at the main table or alone in her room. Was she still a royal, or merely a royal inconvenience? The absurdity of bureaucracy around a toddler's meals only deepened the tragedy. Nobody knew what she was anymore. Not even Elizabeth. Her identity was shattered before it ever had a chance to congeal. Yet she absorbed the chaos with unnatural poise, where another child might have wept for a mother or begged for a father's favor. Elizabeth watched. She learned. And above all, she remembered. It was not Mary, the elder half-sister, long-suffering daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who bore the deeper scar of humiliation. It was Elizabeth, who was raised in the shadow of a mother vilified and a father lionized, knowing full well that her very being had once been hailed as triumph, then cast aside as treason. Her silence became her fortress, her thoughts an arsenal. Those early years were spent not in fairy tales, but in calculating glances and careful courtesy. She mastered the art of invisible grief, the kind that smiles at tutors while quietly noting which windows faced the gate and how quickly a horse could be saddled if flight ever became necessary. And still, she grew. Her mind, sharp as a needle, drank in language like wine. French, Italian, Latin. Greek they became weapons. Veils, mirrors. Words were her inheritance, and translation her shield. While other children memorized prayers, Elizabeth rewrote Cicero. While sons trained with swords, she practiced rhetoric. She did not ask to be read to, she asked for the ink. And in that ink, she slowly began to reclaim the self that the law had tried to erase. Yet even as she grew in knowledge, she never outgrew the wound. Her portraits from this time are not those of a child basking in royalty, but a girl always half turned one eye on the page, one on the door. Her father, though occasionally affectionate in writing, remained distant, and his court operated as a machine with no sentiment. She knew that even a smile from the king could be a performance. In her world, security was never earned, only borrowed and always at interest. When Henry remarried again, to the devout and dignified Catherine Parr, Elizabeth briefly glimpsed what maternal steadiness could feel like, yet even this comfort was tinged with calculation. Parr was more than a stepmother, she was a political shield, and she would soon offer Elizabeth up to the serpents of courtly ambition. But before that descent, Elizabeth watched, once more, a shift in her standing. In 1544, her father reinstated her and Mary into the line of succession. This act, framed as mercy, was in truth a pragmatic contingency if Edward, the long-awaited son, should die childless. Then the Tudors would need heirs to preserve their divine image. Elizabeth, at 11, understood this better than anyone. Her restoration was not love, it was strategy. Still, she seized the moment as only she could by delivering to her father a New Year's gift written in 3 languages, bound in crimson cloth, and bearing a flourish of calligraphy so elegant it looked carved rather than inked. It was more than a gift. It was an announcement: I am not my mother's ghost, nor my father's mistake. I am England's most dangerous subject, not by force, but by mind. And in this act, Elizabeth stitched together a mask she would wear for the rest of her life, the scholar princess, studious and serene, whose obedience was never quite submission. Her trauma was not buried, it was refined, sharpened, transmuted. She became not what they declared her to be, but what they would never suspect: a girl who had already survived ruin, and who now studied power like scripture. What the world saw was a girl sitting straight-backed with her hands folded. What the girl saw was a kingdom built on promises that could be revoked with ink or blood. And she vowed, never aloud, never with tears, that if ever the crown touched her head, it would not be because she was chosen. It would be because no one could stop her. The garden was quiet, but not innocent. Its hedges cast long shadows over the stone walls of Chelsea Manor, where a young Elizabeth walked each morning under the watchful eyes of servants and courtiers, and one man who watched differently. She was 14, a student of Cicero, a writer of flawless Latin epistles, a girl who had endured disgrace and emerged composed. But no education, however rigorous, could prepare her for the strange treachery of desire when it came not as romance, but as political theater. Thomas Seymour entered her life not as a villain, not at first, but as a charming man with too much perfume and too little patience. Recently wed to her beloved stepmother, Catherine Parr, handsome, reckless, and seething with envy at his elder brother, Edward Seymour. Now Lord Protector of England, Thomas was a man who saw every human relationship as a rung to be climbed. Elizabeth, astute beyond her years, sensed his ambition before she fully understood its implications. Yet she was also flattered. Who would not be, when a man with the bearing of a courtier and the eyes of a hunter made you the center of his gaze? He teased her, cut her gowns with a knife in mock playfulness, tickled her when the dawn was still cold on the windowsill, what the court called romping. History would later struggle to name. It was neither courtship nor seduction, not entirely. It was something more insidious, a test of power disguised as affection. Seymour knew precisely what he was doing, even if Elizabeth did not yet fully know what was being done. He was not simply pursuing her, he was staking a claim on what might someday rule. She, in turn, walked the razor's edge between girlhood and political currency, aware that her body had become a battlefield where men wagered futures. Catherine Parr, distracted by her own pregnancy, first laughed off the antics, but even the softest heart can harden when humiliation seeps through its seams. When she caught them alone, Elizabeth blushing, Seymour, too near the truth, shattered the household like a dropped chalice. The Queen sent Elizabeth away. No farewell, no embrace, just silence and dismissal. It was the last time Elizabeth would see the woman who had shown her the closest thing to maternal care. Parr would die not long after childbirth, her final delirium haunted by visions of betrayal. Elizabeth, now motherless again, was left with nothing but suspicion and disgrace. Seymour did not relent. Freed from the constraints of marriage, he resumed his schemes with more audacity, proposing marriage to Elizabeth as if the scandal had been nothing more than a missed opportunity. Even Cat Ashley, Elizabeth's trusted governess, urged her to consider the match. But something had shifted in the girl. She had felt the heat of shame, the cold of exile, and the slow constriction of rumor turning into accusation. The innocence, if it ever existed, was gone. She refused, not with weeping, not with outrage, but with the kind of calm that terrified men like Seymour, a measured silence that implied deeper calculation. He, meanwhile, turned his eyes toward the young King Edward VI, plotting to seize control of the boy or perhaps even abduct him. His desperation outpaced his cunning. One night, discovered with sword in hand near the king's chambers, he killed a spaniel in panic. The metaphor was not lost on the court. A man who could murder the king's dog in fear might do worse in ambition. He was arrested, charged with treason, and dragged to Tower Hill. Elizabeth, now 15, found herself once again beneath the eye of suspicion. She was interrogated, her rooms searched, her servants imprisoned. Cat Ashley was taken to the tower and questioned under threat of torture. Letters were seized, words twisted. Her silence was weaponized against her. She was asked again and again, did she know of Seymour's plots? Had she agreed to marry him? Was she pregnant? The weight of implication bore down on her fragile household like the fog over the Thames. Elizabeth gave them nothing. No confession, no plea, only composure. When rumors spread that she carried Seymour's child, she penned a letter to the Lord Protector, denying the slander in language as precise as a blade. "These are shameful slanders, and I shall most heartily desire your lordship that I may come to court to show myself as I am." It was not innocence she projected, but sovereign command, the voice of a girl who had learned that the truth could be shaped if spoken clearly, and that dignity was often the final refuge of the hunted. Seymour was executed in March of 1549. Elizabeth watched the world swallow him, and with him, the last illusions of protection. What she gained in that moment was not triumph, but clarity that in England, a woman's virtue could be weaponized just as easily as her ambition, and that survival required more than intelligence. It required restraint, concealment, and a will tempered not by affection, but by memory. The garden was no longer a place of play. It had become the proving ground, and the blade that once danced too close to her skin would never again find her unprepared. In the months that followed, Elizabeth retreated into discipline. She took up her Greek texts with renewed severity, not as lessons, but as shields. She trained her voice to move with calm authority. Her gestures to reveal nothing, even her laughter became selective, rehearsed, released only when it could buy her safety. And yet, behind it all, she was changing. No longer the wide-eyed girl with ink-stained fingers and reverent curiosity. She was now the architect of her own mythos. She began to wear simplicity like armor, appearing at court with unadorned hair, bare skin, no jewels. The gesture was not piety, it was message. A woman untouched, unswayed, untaken. To the nobles, it seemed humility. To the women, chastity. But to those with ambition, it was a warning. She had seen what happened to women who became tools. She would be no man's lever, no man's hostage. In private, she still battled the nausea, the headaches, the tremors that followed each interrogation. She bled when the pressure mounted, her body remembering what her voice never spoke. But these frailties she buried under layers of poise. The new Elizabeth, born in the ashes of Seymour's fall, did not trust, not entirely, not anymore. She walked slower, listened longer, and in the silence, she built a fortress of intellect, memory, and control. It was not love that saved her, it was vigilance. And from that vigilance, a queen began to form. The smoke began before the fire. Long before the pyres were lit in the streets. Long before England's skies darkened with the stench of burning flesh. Elizabeth had already sensed it in glances, in whispers, in the turning of keys. Her brother, the boy King Edward VI, was dying. The once cherished prince with a pale brow and sickly chest had tried to reshape England with a prayer book and a trembling pen, but tuberculosis writes its own doctrine, and his death was no longer a possibility, it was a countdown. In his desperation, Edward had ignored the law of his father and rewritten succession in favor of Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, 15 and pious, but a puppet nonetheless. Elizabeth, who understood the uses of girls better than anyone, did not flinch. She did not object. She waited, and when Edward died in July 1553 and Jane was proclaimed queen, Elizabeth, neither conspirator nor loyalist, remained at Hatfield, sharpening her silence into a shield. It was Mary, her half-sister, daughter of Catherine of Aragon and champion of the old faith, who rose like a storm from the east, rallying nobles and villagers alike. Elizabeth joined her on the road to London, their horses side by side, their smiles rehearsed, but their histories unforgotten. The city gates opened with a roar, and Mary entered as queen, her sister trailing like an uncertain shadow. The fires had not started yet, but the kindling had been laid. At first, the sisters played at reconciliation. Elizabeth, pragmatic as ever, curtsied with perfect form, spoke of unity, and even agreed on paper to attend Mass. But when the appointed day arrived, she complained of stomach pains, a diplomatic illness that neither Mary nor the court physicians believed. It was not merely defiance, it was survival. Elizabeth knew too well what happened when one bowed too deeply to a queen whose crown had been forged in the fires of martyrdom and vengeance. Mary had inherited not just the throne, but a faith built on ritual, obedience, and pain. To her, salvation required the burning away of heresy, and soon the smoke rose. The Protestants, who had once flourished under Edward's reforms, were dragged to the stake. Men and women, young and old, burned alive in public squares. Their screams considered music to the ears of the faithful. Elizabeth watched and remained quiet. She adorned her body with modesty, kept her prayers private, and wrapped herself in the one belief that had not betrayed her endurance. But England's unrest swelled beyond sermons and executions. Mary had chosen to marry Philip of Spain, a Catholic prince whose foreign blood sparked outrage across the realm, in taverns, in alleys, in manor halls. The fear of Spanish control fermented into open rebellion. One letter reached Elizabeth, written by Sir Thomas Wyatt, declaring his intent to rise against the Queen and prevent the foreign union. Elizabeth did not respond in writing she had learned, but delivered a verbal message vague enough to suggest sympathy without committing treason. It was a line she had walked her entire life to nod without kneeling, to promise without swearing. But the rebellion failed. Wyatt's forces crumbled before they reached London, and in the ashes of his ambition, the Queen turned her gaze toward her sister. Elizabeth was summoned to Whitehall. She stalled, claiming illness. The Queen's doctors overruled her, and so, day by agonizing day, she traveled the 23 miles to court, arriving to find Wyatt beheaded and his body quartered. She was questioned, interrogated, then, at last, ordered to the Tower. The news came at dusk. Elizabeth wrote that night her most desperate letter, penning line after line with trembling fingers, begging for an audience, for fairness, for life. "I am not without fault," she wrote, "but I beseech your majesty, let not my enemies be my judges." She spilled ink like tears across the parchment, then scored long diagonal slashes across the empty spaces to prevent additions of plea-turned prison wall. No answer came. At dawn, the guards arrived. Rain was falling. The river ran high. As she stepped from the barge to the slick stone steps of Traitor's Gate, she stumbled, nearly falling. "I come not as a traitor," she cried to the crowd, "but as true a subject to Her Majesty as any now living." Some soldiers knelt, others looked away. The Tower swallowed her in silence. 8 weeks passed. Damp stone, distant screams, the clink of keys and the sound of her own heart thudding against sleepless nights. Across the courtyard, the spot where her mother had died stared back at her through the lattice window. Elizabeth's body rebelled fever, bleeding, collapse, not out of weakness, but out of pressure, the pressure of terror held too tightly, for too long. Still, she survived. Mary lacked the evidence to kill her. There was suspicion, testimony, innuendo, but Elizabeth had left no trail, even under scrutiny. She remained composed. No confession, no letter, nothing. On the morning of May 19th, Sir Henry Bedingfield arrived with soldiers. Elizabeth believed it was the end. May 19th, her mother's execution date. She wept, begged, pleaded. But she was not led to the scaffold. She was led to Woodstock Palace, a prison in all but name. There, in a house filled with locked doors and careful footsteps, she remained under surveillance for nearly a year. She wrote few letters, trusted fewer people. Her jailer reported that she kept mostly to herself, walking in the gardens, reading in the sunlight, rarely smiling. Mary's regime darkened further. The Queen's phantom pregnancy, the swelling belly that birthed only disappointment, marked a turning point. Philip grew distant. The public discontent grew louder, and the fires continued. Elizabeth returned to court only briefly, summoned to stand in the margins of a court that no longer trusted her. She wore plain gowns, spoke in measured tones, appeared penitent but never defeated. And when Philip suggested marrying her to a Catholic ally, she did not rage, she did not resist, she delayed. A delay that would outlast Philip's presence in England entirely. In time, Mary's body began to fail. A second phantom pregnancy revealed itself as decay. Her counsel urged her to name Elizabeth as heir. She resisted, then relented. 10 days later, the messengers rode to Hatfield, finding Elizabeth in the gardens beneath an oak tree, her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes fixed not on the sky but on the earth. When they bowed and named her Queen, she did not cheer. She knelt. "This is the Lord's doing," she said, "and it is marvelous in our eyes." But her thoughts, perhaps, turned not to heaven, but to the tower, to the stake, to Seymour's breath on her neck, to her mother's dress soaked in blood. She was queen now, but she had learned that fire does not always come with warning. Sometimes it begins in the silence. Sometimes it hides in the smoke. It was not the crown itself that daunted her. It was the silence that followed its placing, the echo that stretched between centuries of men and this singular moment when a woman, once called bastard, once nearly beheaded, now stood at the center of a throne built from the bones of her own bloodline. Elizabeth did not tremble. She moved with grace, but not gentleness. Each step down the cloth-lined aisle of Westminster Abbey was weighted not just by the expectation of England, but by the memory of every locked door, every interrogator's breath, every prayer whispered in the tower when death seemed only a heartbeat away. On January 15th, 1559, she wore 3 crowns and one truth: that she had reached this place not through inheritance alone, but through refusal to break, to yield, to betray her own mind. The coronation was a spectacle of gold and incense, bells and boughs, yet no opulence could conceal the scars beneath the velvet. As Bishop Oglethorpe anointed her with oil in the 7 sacred places, Elizabeth was no longer simply being blessed, she was being sanctified by survival. They could call her the Virgin Queen, but they could never make her innocent. Her celibacy was no vow of purity. It was a fortress, a deliberate denial of the trap that had ensnared queens before her. She had watched what happened to women who loved too freely. They were executed, discarded, or diminished. Anne Boleyn, her mother, had been the crown's seduction and its sacrifice. Catherine Parr, her stepmother, had died trying to reconcile duty with desire. Elizabeth chose differently. She would wed no man. She would wed a nation. And so, as the ring was slipped onto her finger, a symbol of mystical marriage between queen and kingdom, Elizabeth understood better than anyone what it meant to possess and to be possessed. The crowd roared as she was enthroned. But inside, the chamber of her mind remained quiet, orderly, alert. She did not see the people cheering. She saw their fickleness. She did not hear celebration. She heard the ticking of rivalries yet to come. There was no illusion now. The throne was not security. It was a stage, and she, its performer, director, and prisoner all in one. Her first acts as monarch were neither sweeping nor sentimental. She did not purge the court with vengeance. Though many expected it, she did not demand tribute or penance. Instead, she walked carefully through the ruins left by Mary's reign, ashes of martyrs, bruised nobility, a country on the verge of implosion. England was fractured, its spirit singed. Elizabeth knew that power imposed from above without theatre below would only deepen the cracks. She turned, therefore, not to fire, but to image. She presented herself as both continuity and revolution, the daughter of Henry, the enemy of tyranny, the pupil of moderation. Her appearance, sober but striking, spoke to both Protestants and Catholics. Her voice, measured, deliberate, and musical, soothed ambassadors while offering no promises. Where her predecessors had ruled with absolutist iron or religious zealotry, Elizabeth crafted her authority like a manuscript, layered, elegant, impossible to imitate. And always, she remembered the sleepless nights at Woodstock, the tears that would not fall at Seymour's hands, the blood that never spilled, though it had come close. Even in her triumph, her body bore the memory of fear. Headaches plagued her during debates. Nausea followed moments of confrontation. These were not weaknesses. They were the side effects of restraint, the bruises left by a lifetime of self-preservation. But she learned, as she always had, how to transmute pain into poise. Riding across the countryside, she let the wind dry her sweat and the sun cure her lingering fevers. Her hunts were not leisure, they were ritual. On horseback, she was not a woman vulnerable to courts or councils. She was an emblem of command, master of motion, and still, even at rest, she did not release the mask. At Hatfield, she walked alone in the gardens, beneath the same trees where she had once read Basil's argument for the sacred solitude of celibacy. There, in the hush between leaves and wind, she could reflect on what she had become not out of choice, but out of necessity. Marriage, she had decided, was too dangerous. Every suitor came with terms, with schemes, with the stench of conquest disguised as affection. Spain had already tried to claim her through Philip. France would offer dukes. England's own nobles would whisper names into the dark. But Elizabeth knew that the moment she gave herself to one man, she would lose herself to many. Better to remain an enigma, a sovereign wrapped in mystery, a figure both longed for and feared. Her body politic became sacred space. Her image was sculpted with intention, pearl-encrusted gowns, high collars, powdered skin, and the glint of distance in her eyes. The Virgin Queen was not merely a title, it was a weapon, a mirror, a myth. And she wielded it as masterfully as any sword. In council chambers, she listened more than she spoke. She let her ministers argue while she observed, not aloof, but analytical. She understood the male fear of female unpredictability, and she used it to her advantage. When she laughed, it could disarm. When she paused, it could freeze a room. When she grew silent, even her oldest advisors grew nervous. This was not deceit. It was strategy born of memory. Too many times had she spoken truth and been punished for it. Too many times had her innocence been twisted into evidence. Now, she gave them only what was necessary, never more. Yet for all her caution, Elizabeth did not rule with coldness. She felt deeply, even if she showed little. She mourned when others died, though she rarely attended funerals. She loved music, poetry, the theater, especially the works of a young playwright named Shakespeare, who would one day immortalize her age. She understood that a kingdom must be ruled by more than sword and seal. It must be inspired. And so, she became England's breath as much as its body. Her reign would outlive those who doubted her, but she never forgot that the crown did not come to her as a gift. It had come after blood, after shame, after silence. It had watched her bleed, and in return, she wore it not as a blessing, but as a pact. She would serve the nation, but she would serve it on her terms, always.